session. I'm extremely excited to be chairing this session with three fantastic speakers. My name is Henry Corrigan Gibbs, and the first speaker of the session is going to be Stefan Somogyi, who works at Google. He has an incredibly impressive resume that I promised I would not share with you because he's very humble in addition to being very accomplished. And he's going to tell us about design, applied cryptography, and humans. So, take it away.
Thanks, Henry. Yeah, my name is Stefan Somogyi. I work on user protection at Google, and I'm also affiliated with the Columbia Journalism School, which is not widely known for the breadth and depth of its cryptographic research. What it does have, however, is students and faculty who are very much at the leading edge of innovation in attacking people. Journalists are disproportionately at risk as targets for any number of reasons, for a wide variety and a broad spectrum of attacks, including online harassment and other bad things that happen to people, especially online. Other demographics that fall into this category are human rights workers. There is a growing population of people who are at disproportionate above baseline risk, and learning during this experience and understanding the reality of their lives and how they have to go through them is very informative for the product work that I do at Google. And this is why this also ties into the general notion of design. During this talk, I'm primarily going to be talking in the context of industrial design. Naoto Fukasawa is a relatively prominent Japanese industrial designer. He has over the years designed many both aesthetically pleasing and highly functional objects. But what particularly distinguishes him in my eyes is he spends a lot of time thinking about the craft of design and articulating it. And so one of the things that I find connected some of my past work with crypto systems with his work in industrial design is this notion of we do have to actually design these things for users. I worked at PGP for many years, and it is not the paragon of usability. And I think this is a currently uncontroversial belief. We have fortunately done better in the meantime, right? We got a little better at this stuff, but we're still not as good as we could get if we apply ourselves. And so one of the first examples in the industrial design space that I'd like to call to your attention is a product from Muji that is quite literally named Mattress with Legs. And you will be shocked to learn that it is in fact a mattress with legs. This has been a tremendously popular product for Muji. Even though it is, one might argue, a fairly basic building block of a home, there are certain aspects that are composable, that are modulatable. Well, one of the things that you can do is you can get different lengths of legs, presumably partially because human legs also differ in their length. But one of the background thoughts of this design was also very efficient use of space in the room that this piece of furniture is in, because there is space underneath there, and if you had stuff to store, the designers didn't want that space to go to waste, and Muji will quite happily sell you some storage units that go very nicely underneath, or if you have less stuff, you can get smaller storage units. But this is the basic building block of this design. In 2015, Muji started collaborating with Narita Airport, and they built this variation on the mattress with legs. They added a backrest because the design brief expanded to people who wanted to use it more as a sofa, who wanted to sit down. These items are in Terminal 3 at Narita, which is the low-cost carrier terminal, and people often have very long layovers there. And so the assumption is people would want to sit down, which is where the backrest comes in. People will also want to lie down. They absolutely will use it as a mattress if they have an overnight layover. And so the basic building block evolved. The fundamental primitive of the mattress with legs remains, and then they scaled it even further and added a little flat, hard surface, because if you're going to be spending hours and hours on a layover at an airport, you might want a beverage, you might want some food. And beverage containers, particularly open ones, are not the kinds of things that you want to put on a curved, soft surface that you might want to sleep on, right? So they evolved the design further to accommodate the possibility of having something that you can put a drink down on. But it all came back to this core design. And within cryptography, we have any number of core designs. We have core algorithms whose properties we understand well over the years. And how we compose these different building blocks into crypto systems differentiates the ones that are usable from the ones that aren't. And so one of Fukasawa-san's thoughts about design is specifically in the realm of being able to use a tool or an affordance without thinking much about it, right? We don't think much about using mattresses. Gravity is a constant on Earth. We know which way is down most of the times, unless we're in a centrifuge, right? And so we should strive to build tools that our users can use safely without an overabundance of advanced training. And so focusing on usability benefits everybody. Now, within the security space, we certainly have collectively been heard on more than a few occasions to say things like, humans are the weakest link in your security system. I think this is corrosive nonsense. Humans are actually your best first line of defense because the human brain has evolved to see patterns and detect anomalies better than any automated system that we can possibly build. So we should be designing to the strengths of the humans and not deliberately try and find ways of doing things that don't play to those very, very strengths. Another area of human competence that I discovered some years ago, I was doing some research into understanding why people returned their mobile phones. And within the cluster of top reasons came the relatively mundane sounding USB, liquid. And so it turns out that people drop their phones in any number of conductive liquids. And at the time, this led to the premature demise of the device. And so even in those days, right, people bought phones with more pixels or more RAM or more CPU or more battery. And someone hadn't thought across the industry that people also drop their phones, and they drop their phones into water. So today, quite a few years later, when everybody got the memo, you see different mobile phone designs specifically differentiate themselves and market themselves as water resistant to a certain way. It took the industry quite a few years to realize that it isn't all about the easily measurable and marketable metrics. It's about the stuff that the users encounter when they're actually using the tool that was designed. Noto is a Latin word. It means I write or I mark. It is also the name of a ballpoint pen that Fukasawa-san designed for the German manufacturer Lamy. And I can show you a picture of this thing, but as you might imagine, pens are very tactile, right? You have to hold them. So one of the distinguishing characteristics of this design is that it's approximately triangular. It feels pretty good in the hand, and you know sort of how to orient it. It also has a very specific feature that you will never get out of this picture, which is it is nominally a clicky pen, but it doesn't click. In contrast, there are clicky pens, and this was a deliberate design decision. Because at some point, the design team that put together this pen wound up in a situation where they were irritated by somebody else clicking their pen. So they said, we're doing a silent one. Now, in my completely unscientific and statistically insignificant testing over the last couple of weeks, I've found a very mixed set of reactions. Some people absolutely hate a non-clicky pen. So not all users are uniformly enamored of this feature. The other thing that I really like about this pen is some of the more subtle details. If you write so much that you use up all the ink and you replace the refill and you screw it back together, you get to a point where you encounter resistance, but you can feel that the triangles don't line up. So you have an immediate tactile sense of it's not quite right, but you hit resistance until you add a little more pressure and Of course, now it doesn't do it. There's a little click. There's a very tactile click. This is something that you will notice a handful of times during the lifespan of this pen, but somebody thought this was important enough to include it. And this brings us to the principle of micro-considerations, which Fukasawa-san talks about quite a lot. It's the attention detail in the tiny little things that you might not encounter day to day, but which communicate to the user that you put a bunch of thought into it and you were very careful in your composition of what you did. And if you look at any number of security systems that have cryptography in them, some evince a great deal of thought and consideration for how it all fits together, and others seem to be a collection of buzzwords that are put into a certain sequence to tick certain boxes. And all of these exist. I would prefer we wind up on the more thoughtful side of things. Now, Noto also has another meaning in this context. It is the typeface name of the typeface that I'm using here for this presentation, and in this context it is short for no tofu. This is not a culinary criticism, but any of you who have worked with Unicode will be familiar with the character that is colloquially known as tofu, and the typeface is designed specifically to try and avoid this glyph, which is the I don't have this character here. Whatever character you are trying to render doesn't exist. So for anybody who doesn't exclusively exist in a 7-bit ASCII world, you're going to encounter this. And so the Noto typeface was specifically intended to include more glyphs from more written languages to prevent the appearance of the tofu character anywhere. And so this brings us to this notion of industrial craft. There's craft work, the attention to detail and design, where you really notice that somebody has put a lot of thought into it, but we work in a space that is dominated by computers, and we want to scale all the things. Very often, though, we might not pick the right metrics. Picking just a metric that gets bigger and that more and more scale becomes measurable doesn't necessarily lead to better quality. Another example of industrial craft is the exposure notification system that we at Google built in collaboration with Apple at the very beginning of the pandemic. And it was from the outset intended as something where the technology wasn't supposed to get into the user's face, but we on the side of the designs related to privacy and security knew full well that we had a requirement, a hard and fast requirement, that we needed to build a system that had very specific privacy preserving characteristics, very specific security characteristics. We also needed to make them explainable. We needed to articulate and document them. We needed to publish our threat model so that those with the expertise to critique us had access to all the information that they needed. And it turns out we pretty much got it right, because the uptake was sufficient that multiple teams in the UK, in Canada, and the Netherlands came back to us with statistically significant results and illustrated clearly that this system helped people. It prevented infections by alerting people about notifications, and preventing infections inevitably saved lives. And we don't really have that luxury very often in tech, where we spend most of our days pushing buttons and staring into flickering rectangles. How often do we get to build something meaningful? Now, from the cryptography side of this system, which, as I said, was fairly well documented, one thing that we discovered is being boring is a real feature. People stopped looking into the system after the initial set of analyses because everybody else had more important stuff to do. And so by making the cryptography inherent in the system initially as open as we could, as transparent as we could, we enjoyed the benefits of a great deal of analysis, after which people said, okay, now we need to worry about other stuff because this particular implementation has become boring. So you have to meet your users where they are. You do not always have the luxury of imposing what is secure or what is private upon your users. You have to think about the environment and the context that they operate in. AES, as we heard, is completely all over the place in all sorts of cryptographic applications, except that we've also learned in the 2 decades since it was standardized that it's still not ideal in environments where you don't have hardware assist. And there are still devices being sold in parts of the world today that do not have hardware AES. Colleagues of mine on the Android team realized that this problem still affected people, and that by using exclusively AES, we were costing people battery life, we were costing people user experience because the CPUs just weren't up to it for certain parts of the world. Now, to be clear, volumetrically, this is not the majority of devices being sold new today, but it is a significant number of people. And so we need to design with an understanding of people who don't fit into the majority. We have to pressure test and stress test our designs. And if I'm somebody who has a phone that doesn't have hardware AES, it is unlikely to be deliberately by choice. And so penalizing these folks and eating up their battery because AES is more expensive on this device than an alternative solution, that's not really the greatest thing. You wind up creating security for rich people, and that's not a particularly good design target. I'd like to show you a video now, which is an excerpt from a documentary film called Objectified, directed by Gary Hustwit, who has very kindly given me permission to show this excerpt. And it makes a very important point in general about design parameters.
We have clients come to us and say, here's our average customer. For instance, female, she's 34 years old, she has 2.3 kids. And we listen politely and say, well, that's great, but we don't care about that person. What we really need to do to design is look at the extremes. The weakest, or the person with arthritis, or the athlete, or the strongest, or the fastest person. Because if we understand what the extremes are, the middle will take care of itself.
Over the years, I've had many conversations with engineering teams who were incorrigibly focused on the majority use cases, and everything else outside of that was an edge case. But in engineering, we also like the idea of testing and stress testing our systems to make sure they are resilient. These users who are outside of the middle, these extreme users that Dan Formosa talks about, are those users, and we need to include them in our design thinking. Now, Dan is formerly a principal at a company called Smart Design, and they designed OXO Good Grips kitchen utensils, which were originally released into the world in 1990, initially only in North America. They are now, 23 years later, a global brand, and they're wildly commercially successful. But at the initial design phase, they were building kitchen utensils for people who are having difficulty with more conventional ones because they were developing arthritis. They are finding it very difficult to hold on to things that are relatively small and hard. So if you've seen one of these kitchen utensils, they have much bigger grips, they have softer grips, they are grippier, so they are less likely to slip out of your hand, especially when wet. So if you have a vegetable peeler, you are probably going to be interacting with your sink. Now, it turns out, by designing kitchen utensils for a nominally extreme use case, somebody developing or who already has arthritis, they wound up creating a very commercially successful product for everybody because that additional usability, that additional design turned out to benefit everybody. So when you're designing your crypto systems, please design your crypto systems for people. Think about how they're actually going to use them in the real world. Don't just think about pixels and battery. Think about the fact that humans drop phones into water, and think about it in advance. Consider what of the micro considerations there are out there that you can integrate into the design of the eventual thing that lands into in the hands of users. And consider how you can build things that are reliable, that are safe and secure, and that work well, and that protect our users' data. And with that, thank you for your attention, and I think we've got a little bit of time for questions.
Great, so we have plenty of time for questions, either on Zoom or in person.
Hi, lovely talk. On the taking into consideration all the little details when designing your system or construction, one thing that I'm mindful of is software never stays static as long as humans are using it. How do you keep up that level of taking into account detail and the cohesiveness of your project or your tool as it evolves over time, as either the needs of its users change or the underlying assumptions of what you built it on evolve or things like that?
It's hard. But as an example of one system that I think got it right, I would recommend the WireGuard design paper, because WireGuard approached the problem space with very strong opinions. And you can overcorrect your algorithmic agility. We learned that firsthand at PGP. That was not so ideal, but we didn't know any better in the early days, right? Because we were worried about planning ahead and making sure that we didn't actually set any traps for our users. What we didn't realize, or I wasn't involved in the very, very early days, but what became clear later is legacy is real, and you have to have backwards compatibility for a certain amount of time. And all of the problems related to that are also really tough on users. There isn't one size fits all answer to your question, but having founded opinions, documenting what those opinions are, seeking input and getting the feedback, and understanding and describing adequately the parameters of your design space are ultimately also going to make it easier to migrate off of it when, at some future point, that is the prudent thing to do. I happened to reread the WireGuard paper not too long ago, and Jason Donenfeld made the very specific point that if at some point one of the core building blocks of the protocol had a vuln, at least the way it's designed would force a very clean break, and everybody would have to update. That's painful if you have to deal with, I don't know, edge devices, IoT devices that have no connectivity, or that have other kinds of software update constraints. But for something like software, which is sort of where your question started, that's not the worst approach. It seems one that is likely to survive over time.
So I have a question from Kay McKelly via Zoom, which is a great question. How do you inspire engineers to create products for a broader swath of people, particularly if they cannot relate to users that are not like them?
You find gentle ways of introducing them to the outside world. Somewhat less snarkily. Look, engineers are perpetually learning, and so part of the issue is how do you get them to understand different design parameters than things that are easily measured? And so, find a friendly anthropologist, drag them out into the field, make sure that you're highlighting some of their biases. There's a really good talk that I'd recommend to anybody interested in this design space. There's a series of talks at Enigma this year, an entire section about designing for at-risk, high-risk users. And one particular talk tells an anecdote of a bunch of security engineers giving some training to some refugees. And I'm not going to steal the punchline or the story because I really do want you to go and watch the video. But this was also one of those situations where the engineers went in assuming that they understood the problem and they weren't listening. And it took a while to actually realize that they had talked right past their audience because they didn't seek the common understanding first. So a large part of it is just making people aware of human factors. I mean, a lot of engineers don't think that usability goes beyond having short and concise command line arguments to their tool, right? That's, I guess, a form of ergonomics, but is a limited one.
From your work on journalism, or just more generally, what are some of the features in cryptography that people need, or the most vulnerable people need? like some of the features that we are not designing with today?
In general, when you are handing a security tool to somebody whose primary knowledge domain isn't security, they don't want their trust betrayed. So having infinite numbers of twiddly little knobs that lead users to potentially find a sharp edge, that's unhelpful. There's a balance in design, though. It turns out that one size doesn't fit all for all at-risk users. So one of the things that my colleagues who do user experience research have discovered that at-risk users in particular need more options rather than fewer ones. But getting the defaults right is crucial because the majority of people aren't going to deviate from the defaults. So you want to find the most secure defaults and make sure that those defaults aren't innately a sharp edge for somebody who is at higher than baseline risk. Unfortunately, it sounds a little bit like a platitude, but it all comes down to the details, right? Like, what's the tool? Is it a messaging tool? Is it a long-term archival tool? Very different threat and risk models, right? Is the nature of the data that needs to be protected very ephemeral? What's your half-life of protection, right? And so if you're going archival, the half-life is very much longer than something that's very ephemeral that potentially needs to be protected only for minutes. I hope that helps.
I was wondering if you had in mind some particularly inspiring crypto systems, like systems that are designed well for people, in your opinion, either pieces of software or papers, any level of maturity. I'm just curious if you have like specific examples you think are particularly well done.
As much as we like to mock it, I do think that understanding how PGP came to be and evolved is actually really useful for us because it has any number of salutary lessons. I think I mean, look, I worked there for a long time, right? I should be super biased in favor of it, but also it has served its purpose. It did things at the time that nothing else did. It actually, for a very, very brief window of time, was the most usable tool out there, which is, in 2023, kind of a mind-blowing statement. But if you look at the continuum of evolution of usability between something like, original 1992 PGP 1.0 command line to where we are today with Signal, right? There's an awful lot of really interesting history in between there. We learned along the way that the actual symmetric ciphers became largely commoditized and that key management was where it's at. And turns out key management is still really hard. I mean, we saw that yesterday, right? Any number of talks where it's like, yeah, key management is hard. It's going to be hard for a while. So I think Signal is a really good example. I think WhatsApp has a lot going for it because it demonstrated that you could actually put well-constructed end-to-end encryption in the hands of a squillion users and they can all use it and enjoy the benefits of it, even though some of the other design parameters of the greater system are notably different from, say, Signal, right? Very different overall parameters. So look for those deltas. Look for the differences and figure out how they apply to your work. Because, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but truly one size does not fit all. And you have to fully embrace that there is no one generic at-risk user. There is no one generic above baseline user. There is no one generic user because the other thing that is really important to call attention to, all of us can become high risk with a latency of about 2 seconds, right? If we have any interaction with social media and something that we post suddenly goes viral, that's it, right? You suddenly are in the realm of high risk and you can't change your entire security posture in 2 seconds. So how do you help people like that? How do you help people who are on the baseline, but then suddenly, for whatever reason, shoot straight up on the risk scale and they need to continue using the tools that they've already had? And this is another reason why you want to design for some of those extremes, as Dan Formosa said, because the middle user, that common user, may suddenly become an extreme user with no warning at all.
Great. So I think we have to leave it there. So let's thank the speaker again. So thanks, Stefan. So the next talk is by Leah Nemissa Rosenblum, who's a fourth-year PhD candidate at Brown, working with Anna Lisianskaya and Seni Kamara. And their work spans an array of topics, from abolitionist teaching practice to zero-knowledge proof systems to digital privacy for marginalized groups. They've done a ton of interesting stuff, and today we're going to hear about cryptography and grassroots organizing. Take it away.
Hi, my name is Leah Nemissa Rosenblum, and I'm here to talk about cryptography for grassroots organizing. This is joint work with Seni Kamara. I want to start with a quote of Philip Rogaway's, which talks about the ability of cryptography to rearrange systems of power, followed by a quote from Lucy Chin, who said offhandedly one day that cryptographers are professional catastrophizers. And this made me laugh, but it's also true that we have a tendency as cryptographers to make a lot of assumptions while threat modeling, and it's not always done necessarily with a deep understanding or awareness of how systems of power actually function in society. So I want to focus on these questions and get people thinking about these questions. How do we as cryptographers understand systems of power? How does this understanding inform our threat modeling and design choices? And how might we work toward building power for communities? And in starting to address some of these questions, we realized that we need kind of a threat modeling paradigm shift. And the properties of this are as follows. One size fits one. So this is exactly what the last talk kind of emphasized, that there's no one size fits all. We can't always make our work the most general. In fact, we need to really start with the unique needs of the population that we are trying to serve with our protocols. Next, to recognize trust as a human property, that digital trust is really an extension of highly complex human trust relationships. We want to work towards a notion of full compromise security. So this is looking at threat modeling from a holistic lens of what are the messy human systems that go into these actual threat models. And finally, we want to work towards optimizing our protocols for communities and not necessarily corporations and governments. This is the outline of the talk. So we already looked at the introduction and threat modeling, and now we're going to look at the definition of grassroots organizing and some lessons from historical context. We define grassroots organizing as a process by which people work from within marginalized communities to affect social, political, economic, and environmental change. I want to begin the historical discussion with the first known example of cryptography for grassroots organizing, which is Operation Vula. And the African National Congress activists created this crypto system to fight against apartheid between 1896 and 1990. Seni goes into detail, in great detail, in his Crypto for the People talk in 2020, so I'm not going to go over all those details now. But we are looking at the requirements here of it being asynchronous, covert, long distance, and public. So it had some pretty unique security requirements. And I want to highlight a quote from one of the activists here, who said, "I went to find out about secure encryption algorithms. All I discovered was that cryptology was an arcane science for bored mathematicians, not for underground activists. However, I learned a few tricks and used these to develop a system to meet our security needs." It's a bit of a harsh take, but I think it's important to highlight that it's not only developing these systems for the people who we are trying to serve, it's also making those systems and the knowledge accessible to people who need that knowledge. Next, COINTELPRO is a prime example of the extent to which state powers are willing to extensively and illegally surveil activists. And this happened in the United States between 1956 and 1971. It also highlights the blurring of boundaries between information gathering and physical violence. So the information gathered as part of this operation did lead to assassination, for instance, of Fred Hampton, and incarceration of many other activists. And we learned in the Church Committee report that there was these tactics, intimidation, manipulation, dragnet information gathering, without really any meaningful oversight and accountability. And we know that a lot of these practices have been ported into the digital era via the Snowden disclosures in 2013. Finally, I want to highlight the importance of the Arab Spring, which happened in many countries between 2010 and 2012. And this was really the first example where social media was used extensively to organize. And in particular, social media increased the speed at which information was disseminated, it increased the amount of information that could be disseminated, and it increased the amount of people that were able to be reached with the information. And people who study the role of social media in the Arab Spring are they all note that social media is a facilitator rather than a direct or independent cause of change. So this is a tool that activists are wielding to facilitate their organizing. So this playbook essentially inspired countless other movements and has brought us into the present day. So next we're going to look at some lessons from the current landscape, which come from a qualitative studies, a collection of qualitative studies of organizers. And I want to frame this discussion around modes of suppression. So the last four of these are the most heavily intersecting with information technology, and specifically surveillance, conspicuous surveillance and covert surveillance speak to the importance of the confidentiality of information and potentially anonymity. How do we protect our identities online? The last two, deception and mass media influence, speak to the importance of having integrity of information and also trust in digital spaces. And these last two sets of properties are often at odds with each other. A nice commentary of how activists manage the difference between these two is a study of Anti-Corruption Foundation activists from Russia. And the study found that the activists balance conspicuous security by having security tools and also educating people about how to use those tools with strategic visibility in order to build a sense of transparency of what they're doing and community. And this is echoed also in Hong Kong, where they had bigger public groups and smaller encrypted groups with a rigorous onboarding process. Next, the importance of digital trust with respect to physical trust. And this is based on a study I did with 50 Black Lives Matter activists in the US in 2020. So there was a danger of immediacy and anonymity in digital spaces, and this was due to the speed at which information and things were being organized at that time, and also the lack of verifiability of some of the accounts that were posting information. And the organizers got around this by using traditional mechanisms. They talked to people. They used their own social networks. They asked people, hey, do you trust this event? Should we show up? Do you think this is a Proud Boys event actually, and they're just trying to trick us into coming, or is this a real event? And so they would decide and evaluate as a community whether they trusted the information that they were reading online. This is also echoed in Hong Kong, where face-to-face preceded phone-to-phone. And to quote one activist, because standing on the front line together is very important for trust. Finally, I want to highlight the importance of device compromise and deletion. And this came from the anti-extradition law amendment bill protests in 2019 from Hong Kong. The activists in this setting were moving towards full compromise security. And this is not only what we would consider forward secrecy or post-compromise security, it's actually a level beyond that. How do we detect that a compromise has taken place? And the activists in this case were using what most of us would consider spyware, so Life360, for example, to figure out whether the people that they were working with had been arrested. And this was a risk assessment that they made to determine, okay, it's more important that we know if they're arrested so we can delete their data than it is to take a risk of using Life360, which they knew was, not the most secure app to use. So they would follow this up. The mitigation strategy would be a mix of making sure everything was wiped when it needed to be wiped. So scheduled and remote deletion, and this is why they chose to use Telegram, even though Telegram's group messages turned out not to be end-to-end encrypted. So there were issues with Telegram, but the deletion factor was really important to them because when arrests occurred, this would compromise contacts on the phone and also chat logs, like the entire history of the chat. And this speaks to collective security culture. So this is a group reflex that is established among community members to minimize information sharing, digitizing, and retaining. I want to talk a little bit about our new project now, synthesizing some of these observations called TIGRO, or Trust Infrastructure for Grassroots Organizing, and then we'll wrap up the talk. We are trying to address this question. So how might we use cryptographic tools to adapt the existing trust and communication platforms of grassroots organizers from physical to digital spaces? And how might we do this without increasing the risk of surveillance, disinformation, and infiltration of grassroots movements? So it lines up with the paradigm shift as follows. This is not an independent platform. It is a flexible library of primitives, and we hope that to apply these primitives in many settings, to apply the private trust network information of people to any setting online. We use an on-the-ground key agreement, which we'll talk a little bit about, over Bluetooth, and this routes the digital trust created in our system to a physical interaction. We move toward full compromise security by having the contacts hold minimal information about one another, and anyone with a shared key can delete. And finally, we consider the individual device computation environment versus our server, which will be operating over relatively small data sets. Our adversarial model is, again, thinking about how to adapt existing threats and mitigation strategies into digital space. And we start by looking at a digital infiltration adversary. This adversary has properties that you might recognize, so it's trying to collect as much information as possible. It can also corrupt the server and corrupt a fraction of the devices, but it can also pose as a group member, not necessarily in a cryptographic sense, and spread false information. In the semi-honest server model, we get privacy and correctness. In the malicious server model, privacy is maintained, but not necessarily correctness, and we cannot count on the server to delete what is on the server. And our security strategy is going to be to establish digital equivalents of existing security practices. So we start with that by establishing security equals trust. And again, human trust, we're trying to create human trust as a core digital security concept. The way organizers build and assess trust depends on a lot of different factors, and we are not trying to make these assumptions for people. We are trying to enable them to make these assumptions and then port them into the digital environment. We do this using grounded cryptographic protocols, and we'll talk more about that. So we reduce digital trust to physical interactions that establish grounded pairs, so it's a pairwise trust relationship. And then we enable the pairs to make qualitative trust measurements and share them in a secure way. Our core protocols first is a ground trust ceremony. The ground trust ceremony is like a signing ceremony in spirit. However, it establishes a symmetric key that is linked to a physical meeting, and it's not a PKI, so there's no public key infrastructure where everything you do in this space is going to be linked to a public key. It is not linkable. We're going to use this key to establish a grounded annotation system, which allows these pairs to share digital annotations of arbitrary people, places, and things. So they'll be able to exchange information about objects online securely. And finally, we have a prototype of grounded trust metrics, which will allow people to quantify trust over their social network graph. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So the ground trust ceremony, we have two organizers here, codenames Alice and Bob. They each have a persistent identifier, ID A and ID B. This is a random identifier just locally stored on the device. And they each have a location. To start and explain the idea, we'll use an ideal functionality for this grounded key agreement where Alice and Bob send their information. The key agreement checks whether they are in the same location. If they are in the same location, it generates a key and returns this key, and they store it. In practice, we can replace this with a QR code exchange, and then Alice and Bob can do any further computations over an authenticated Bluetooth channel. We won't talk about what those further computations are, but just giving you an idea. And they now share a key that's rooted in their physical interaction. We can use this to build an annotation system. So this is the Tigro server, and on the Tigro server, they have a shared encrypted mailbox. Again, we don't have time to go into the details, unfortunately, but this shared encrypted mailbox is authenticated based on the key KAB, so only Alice and Bob have access to this mailbox. And so now let's say Alice meets Charlie, and Alice wants to let their contacts know that Charlie is or is not a trusted person, that if they meet Charlie, that they can kind of tell from Alice's opinion what the trust level for Charlie should be. So maybe Alice says, I met them at a mutual aid event, they seem trustworthy. Or maybe Alice didn't have such a good opinion and they were agitating at what's supposed to be a peaceful event. And so Alice annotates, sends the annotation, and stores it in the mailbox. Now let's say Bob meets Charlie, and Bob wants to check and see if they have any mutual contacts and what those mutual contacts have said. So Bob can get the mail and learn whether Charlie is trustworthy in Alice's opinion or not. This works for events, comments, posts, anything you can hash essentially. So let's say there's an event that's a protest online and that Alice sees and the organizer is Eve. Alice can hash this event into an identifier and then say, this event is being organized by friends. Hope to see you there. So now all of Alice's contacts will know this is a trustworthy event. Or maybe Alice says, no one can confirm the identity of Eve. Proceed with caution. Sends to the mailbox, and now Bob, if Bob sees the same event, can go and check the mailbox and see whether they should trust this event and show up and risk showing up. So they can now digitally and confidentially share trust assessments of any person, place, or thing. This is a very high-level overview of the trust metrics. So here you have an example of a social network graph where the 1 represents a trust relationship. So here, Charlie trusts Alice and Bob trusts Alice. However, no one trusts Charlie necessarily. So that would be a 0. And we would expect, our hypothesis is that over this grounded social network, the hyperlink-induced topic search or HITS algorithm might be able to give us meaningful measures of a person's connectivity, so their physical proximity to trusted organizers, or their leadership role in relation to others. So in this context, lots of people trust Alice. So maybe Alice can show others that they're a leader with respect to other people. There are disclaimers here. These quantifiable metrics are still functions of qualitative metrics. So this is very much not just putting numbers on things. We have to be careful about what do these numbers mean. And so the 0 and 1, for example, might be the wrong way to go about this. We might use a more fine-grained scale, using a survey, for example. And this data, digitizing this data, even in encrypted form, may still be too risky. So we want to be really careful to communicate what we are generating and sharing. The long-term goals for this project, first to finish the analysis, and then a bunch of really long-term goals are to prototype and then build this into applications. And help welcome. So if you're interested in this project, for example, we need help on the implementation side and also conducting user studies to figure out if we really do have the right notions of trust and to get some of these design elements nailed down as well. And phase 2 is to build out applications that are more specific to the contexts of what people actually need. So the one-size-fits-one, we're going to have a lot of different iterations of this, different optimizations for different groups. And finally, just to think about what kind of world we want to build with this work. So just keeping with some of the consistent questions that we've asked throughout the talk and thinking about those. With that, I'll conclude. Thanks for listening.
So we have time for maybe one quick question, and there are a couple here on Zoom. So Mike says the solution that you're presenting is for the group of people that are already connected in a form of community or ideas. The others that are not aware of this situation might not seek such complex approaches. Do you have any plans or ideas on connecting external people to existing communities and to make it safe and easy for them to do so?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the public-private paradigm balance here is important. You do want to maintain a certain public profile to bring people in, and this is a consistent trend that we've seen in these qualitative studies, that there is a public-facing aspect of information sharing and a private-facing aspect. And so I think this crypto system is more for the private-facing aspect, and so what it can do is it can also give us some added protection in the public-facing aspect as well, but you can still have a public-facing aspect. So it allows you to kind of incorporate more trust into the public-facing aspect, and I do think that these existing channels, so for example, social media and reaching people directly with community outreach is a great way to bring people in and to get them involved in organizing, and then you can introduce them to the more private-facing tools.
Great. Thanks so much. So let's thank Leah again. And I'm happy to introduce the last speaker of the session. Sophia Selly is a cryptography researcher at Brave, and she works on a variety of privacy technologies, including secure messaging, privacy pass, private information retrieval, and many more things. So she's been a cryptographic engineer at Cloudflare and holds a couple leadership roles in the IETF, working on post-quantum crypto and also human rights in protocols. And on top of all of that, she led the design of the version 4 of the off-the-record messaging protocol, which you, I'm sure, have heard of. So please take it away.
Thank you very much, Henry, for that introduction. And today what I'm going to be talking about is what it means actually to design cryptography for small organizations and projects. And what we're going to be using today is an example of 2 projects that are going to serve as examples. They have some limitations. Those 2 schemes are the STAR scheme and the Proto-PRS schemes. And if you want to find more information about them, you can go and click those links in the slide. This is also a joint work submission with Alex Davison and Peter Schneider. And with that, let's get into it. So just to a little bit set the scene, this talk actually doesn't concern that much about or heavily on the theoretical concerns of cryptography, but rather it concerns about who benefits from cryptography and what kind of systems we decide to deploy and release. So one of the things that we heard in some of the previous talk is that sometimes when we design cryptography, we're actually designing it from our worldview, from the limits of our language, from the limits of our world. And this sometimes don't serve all of the users and all of the social context of those users because we have limitations when we are actually designing it because we're limiting in the world. So we sometimes should strive actually to create cryptography that does not serve only the users that look like us, but also many other cases of users. So just to also to set the scene, sometimes cryptography in practice actually does not work because sometimes it doesn't take into account many cases that are not considered edge cases, but actually there are cases that happen in the real world. So for example, authentication systems sometimes fail in practice because they don't take into account device coercion situation or, for example, situation of ongoing surveillance that some intimate partner violence cases suffer. Sometimes this cryptography has high computational costs and communication costs that are unfeasible to be deployed by small organizations and also by small projects. And this in turn translates that they will that they are going to be having high financial costs as well that are again unfeasible to be reached by a small organization and small projects. Sometimes this kind of cryptography is not overtly concerned about policy or legal concerns or about human rights considerations. Sometimes it contributes to a centralized internet because if we're only pushing cryptography that has high computational and communicational costs and that in turn turns into high financial costs, this also means that only big organizations are the ones that are able to deploy, and hence it also contributes to centralizing the internet even further. So again, what this maybe actually means is that we're actually deploying privacy and security considerations for the ones that can afford it. So recently we have seen that some big organization has been pushing forward for actually putting into the real world and deploying some new privacy preserving schemes, which again, this is really great because we actually have to be pushing forward for these properties to exist in the real world. But sometimes it does not work for the many. So the 2 big examples that have been pushed forward in the recent years are privacy preserving measurements, PPM schemes, and private information schemes, PIR schemes. And the question that we seek to answer in this talk is if these proposals or the proposed schemes for these 2 types of schemes can be used or cannot be used by a small organization that has constrained budgets or are even volunteer run. So the current proposed schemes that right now are into consideration to be deployed or standardized have either all of this set of small problems. They either are computational and communicationally expensive. They sometimes rely on non-collusion assumptions in which you will have to have a set of non-colluding servers that sometimes in the real world are hard to get by, or expect several rounds of communication between servers and between clients that in turn translate to high communicational costs. You sometimes need to trust third parties or to have a specialized hardware. You require high financial costs because you're using complex cryptography that sometimes is not going to be available for all of the users of the world because it requires specific devices or requires a specific hardware. And in this case, sometimes also it does not work for many data types because it only works for example, only numerical data types and not for other data types. And if you want other data types, you have to implement now another scheme, which in turn translates that you have to maintain 2 different code bases, which again can lead to security bugs and also high financial costs. Okay, so just again, it is great to have these schemes that aim to provide more privacy-preserving properties, but are these the only schemes that we choose to standardize and deploy? Do they work for everybody and in many cases? Or are we forgetting maybe other uses that don't look like us? Are we limiting the use of our words to only what we know? Should we also strive to actually design cryptography for all the types of uses and all the social situations that are not the ones that we are aware of? And if we're trying to deploy these systems that maybe are limiting to many of them, we're also denying access to other systems because we are deploying them. So is this the only technology that we choose to create? One example here that I highlighted, this is a quote from a research from Derechos Digitales, and they went to Chile and they asked several people in Chile, especially from the rural areas, to see if biometrics actually work for them in an authentication scheme system. And then what they found out is that for the many, this actually doesn't work, because in many rural areas, people will have the biometrics not so clear because they do manual work. So this, again, authentication is great, but sometimes it does not work for everybody. And sometimes when we push forward to some of these schemes, as for example, biometrics, it means in turn that we are denying access to other services, to maybe accessing then their health services or their education or their economic records, because we're only having this specific system that does not work for them. So do these privacy-preserving schemes that I just highlighted in some previous slides, do they also fall in the same trap? For example, if you cannot run on a really expensive PRS scheme, does that mean that you will not be able to access a specific database that, for example, holds your health records or your academic transactions? And if, for example, you cannot run on a specific expensive PPM scheme, does it mean that then your use case will not be taken into account when you take those measurements from end users? So again, just again to ask that question, do they work only for the ones that can afford it? And again, we do need these privacy-preserving schemes because, for example, we need PPM schemes because we need to know how systems operate in different cases, how some software and hardware systems work. Those are essential, and it is essential to actually get them in a privacy-preserving way. And we also need PRS schemes because private information retrieval should be something that is available for everybody if we want to query a specific database. So let's look just at one specific limitation. Some of the PPM schemes and some of the PRS schemes, for example, talk about the limitation of having a non-colluding server. And while this is great in theory and it's easy to write about it in theory, in practice sometimes there's limitations because maybe that private data that you're collecting from your users cannot be located in specific regions in the world, even the representation of that. So where are you going to be placing that third non-colluding server has to be a specific consideration. There's a lot of legal and policy considerations that you have to take into account. And also, if that specific model has high communication and computational cost that translates into financial cost, does it mean that this third-party service that you're going to be using for non-colluding is going to be a pay-for-usage one? And if that's the case, that in turn means that some users will not be able to access this because they don't have the financial resources to do so. So again, this is not a theoretical concern. Teams building software for privacy-critical users have heavily constrained budgets or maybe even volunteer-run. Cryptography systems that require large budgets will not serve the many categories of users, even though they're pushing for really nice properties. So maybe let's look at a change of priority, and that's the subject of the research that we were currently undergoing. Maybe some smaller organizations, for example, might prioritize things as simpler trust assumptions and requirements, simpler or more established cryptographic primitives, lower cost, and failure modes. And with this in mind, we seek to design these two PPM and PRS scheme. And again, these are not like the perfect schemes, they have limitations, but at least what we try is have the base of what it means to design for maybe other users that don't look like us. So let's start for the first one, which is this PPM scheme, which is a scheme that takes measurement from clients in a privacy-preserving way. If you want to learn more about it, again, I invite you to click on the links of this slide. So what it is that it's a K-threshold aggregation scheme that uses really boring cryptography. It uses OPRS for a deterministic randomness generation. You can also generate this randomness in a local manner by using hash functions, for example. It uses a depth secret sharing, but any other kind of secret sharing scheme will also do. And it uses an encryption algorithm as AES. So it's really easy to get by all of these boring cryptography because there's a lot of open source implementation of that. It works with any data type, and of course, because it is a K-threshold aggregation scheme, it has a degree of leakage. It has 3 phases, and I'm just going to go briefly over them because we don't have that much time. I'm really happy to talk to anybody that is more interested in the scheme later after this talk. So the first one is just this randomness extraction that I was talking to you about. Basically, you're going to get one measurement from a specific client, and you're going to deterministically derive randomness for it by using an OPRF server, for example, or by using a hash function. Then we go into the second phase, which is when you have the randomness that we're going to be calling R1, you're going to divide it into three values, which is R1, R2, and R3. From R1, you're going to deterministically derive a symmetric key, which you're going to use to encrypt your specific measurement, and we're going to call that ciphertext CI. And also, you're going to secret share that specific secret. The secret is going to be R1. You're going to secret share it by using locally the derived R2 value, and you're going to be return some shares. And as a client, what you do is that you create a message that is going to be a concatenation of CI, the share, and a specific tag that is just a way that the server is going to aggregate all of the measurements. From the server side, once you get all of these messages, what you're going to do is that you're going to create a batches subset of case size in which you're going to put all of the measurements depending if they share the same tag. That's why the tag is important. You divide them in these subsets of case size, then you perform the recovery algorithm into that case size, you recover R1, you derive deterministically the symmetric key, and then you're able to decrypt the specific measurement that your client sent. And as you see, this is very boring. It's very easy to do. So it's really easy to implement. It uses boring cryptography. You don't need any kind of trust assumption on a non-colluding server because you have a single server that does the aggregation for you. And this in turn means that this scheme has cheap communication and computational costs, which means that a lot of users indeed can use it. And a small organization and smaller projects can actually implement it. And indeed, from the financial level, what we found out is that it's 20 times cheaper than the cost of running the nearest scheme similar to a star. Now let's look at the other scheme, which is a PIR scheme, a private information retrieval one. If you want to learn more about it, again, I welcome you to click on the links on the slide. So it's called Frodo PIR because it's based on the LWE, the decisional LWE assumption, and not on the ring one. So it's called Frodo because you're tossing the ring, but you're still hiding your query from the server, that in this case is Sauron. And how is it phased? It's basically that this is a PIR scheme, and it's a stateful one, which means that we're going to have an offline phase and an online phase. Basically, on the offline phase, what we do is that we prepare the database and also a set of query parameters. So later in the online phase, we can actually launch the query and get the value back. I'm not again going to go into the mathematical details of this, but if you're interested more about it, please find me after the talk. So as I said, this is an LWE base, which in turn means that it's really easy to implement because it requires no polynomial arithmetic or fast Fourier transforms. And indeed, the scheme fits all of the operations in 32 integers. It also, again, does not require any non-colluding server because you have a single server that is going to be returning you the correct value that you query for in a database in a private manner. And we also don't need to store any extra information apart from the pre-processed parameters that I just showed you. So that means that also from a memory space, it's much, much cheaper to run. Okay, so why it works again for a smaller organization? Because again, this is using boring cryptography that is easy to implement and deploy. It uses, again, one single server model, so you don't have to try to find in the wild a non-colluding server, rather just have one server and you're ready to go. You don't need to buy any specialized hardware, and you can easily implement it and to maintain it. So just maybe now to summarize, after looking at these schemes, then in the future, what design considerations can we have? So a little bit of inspiration from what we saw. Boring cryptography does indeed work in practice, and sometimes it's really good for smaller organizations and projects and for a really big set of users, even though it is sometimes considered not novel enough. All of the cryptographic primitives that I show you in these schemes can be considered very boring. They have been in the literature for decades now, but they still work for many of the cases that we need. It is available then for the many. It is cheap. It is fast and has low computational costs. And it still has a lot of open problems, even though maybe they are not the most novel ones. There's still a lot of open research problems on them. Simple trust assumptions also work for a smaller organization because it's easier to think about in a model it only exists one specific server that is either going to be aggregating or performing queries, rather than trying to find another server that is not going to be colluding with that server. And just to give you a little bit of a recommendation as part of your research, we do need to address also financial costs as part of our research. It's not enough to only say the computational and communicational cost of a scheme, but also how that translates into the reality, into financial costs. And what we need is that we need as a community to think about outside the limits of our walls. We need to design also for people that might not look like us, that don't have access to all of the resources that we have, that maybe don't have access to the devices that we have, or the good internet connectivity that we have. We also have to think about that kind of people. Privacy is crucial, but it should not be only for the ones that can afford it. And we should create systems that do not deny access to other systems because those people cannot run your specific scheme. They should still have access to whatever health database or educational database they should have access to. So the limits of our world need to be expanded. We need to do inclusive cryptography design for diverse people. Not everybody in the world will look like us, so when we're actually designing the schemes, we also have to think about the people that don't look like us. We need to provide privacy and security properties for the many, even though if the schemes that end up because of these are not novel enough and are considered boring. We need to provide the schemes that aim to enhance access rather than to deny it. So this is not easy, and it's a huge challenging task in which you have to do an amalgamation of user research and also of design research, but we should probably do it as a community. And with that, I'll give you some references, and also just to let you know, Proto-PIR is a design that we did, but Henry Korean-Gibbs and his group also arrived at the same solution, so I also listed their paper over here if you're interested to learn about it. And with that, thank you very much.
Great, so we have time for a couple of questions. So maybe I'll start off with one while we're waiting. Have you thought about using either of these technologies at Brave? Like, what's the status of deployment, or how are those discussions going?
Yes, so we actually have been thinking about that. Right now, there's some ongoing work to put the PPM scheme into the actual browser, and that should be landing hopefully by the next trimester. And about Proto-PIR, yes, but specifically on the case of doing, for example, compromised credentials checking, because that's a system that you can actually use PIR for. And having it in the browser will mean also that the users can check if their password, for example, or any other credential has been leaked, and then in a cheap manner also find about it or not. So yeah, those are the two cases.
Any last question? All right, if not, let's thank Sophia again, and we have a coffee break.